As you'll see here, my efforts to come up with an interesting, witty title failed miserably, but essentially managing teaching teams, what I've been teached. Okay, so this presentation starts with a story. So here's me pre-2021 working as an academic at another university, skipping along through my unit convener duties, taking postgraduate units in psychology with maybe maximum of 40 to 45 students, very contained, didn't require a teaching team at all, and pretty much was able to run my own show. Let's fast forward to 2021. I land my dream job at Macquarie University. I'm eager to get started, to learn what units I'll be convening, what my academic duties will look like at Macquarie. And then I find out I'll be convening a unit with 1,200 students. And so, of course, the initial reaction was shock, horror. How am I going to do this? What's this going to look like? And how will this go with managing those complexities that come with a large teaching team, not having done this before? And so my objective today is to provide some tips in the form of 10 lessons that I've learned along the way for managing large teaching teams. I do want to give special thanks to Professor Kathy McMahon, who was the previous unit convener, now retired, and also Dr. Lorna Peters, who's also retired from School of Psychological Sciences and gave lots of tips along the way. And of course, Dr. Alyssa Beef, who you may all know, is our undergraduate psychology course director and has taught me everything I know. I don't profess to be an expert on this subject, but rather a quick study. And so I hope to be able to provide some reflections on this experience of having convened these two large co-taught units for a little bit more context. So what these units look like, they are developmental psychology units. There's an internal delivery and an external Open Universities Australia delivery. Last year, we had the additional complication of the internal delivery being divided into two separate offerings, an on-campus and online flexible delivery offering. And as you can see there, over the last couple of years, the unit has grown exponentially. In terms of scale, we're talking about projections this year of roughly 1,400 students and looking at recruiting about 15 tutors and 30 markers to be able to manage that unit. And so what I've put together are a bunch of what I guess I would call common sense must-dos with some extra hot tips for how to go about managing teaching in this context and the management of the teaching team. So it all starts before it all starts. So my first lesson that I learned was to start recruiting early, but not too early. I think I sound like the Goldilocks of unit convening when I say that. But essentially, it's really important to make sure you recruit your team early enough to allow for all the tasks that are required before your unit kicks off, so you can set things up really well from the start and hopefully have things move in a smooth direction accordingly. Of course, if you recruit too early, it is important to bear in mind that tutor and marker availability might change closer to session. And so it's really about getting that balance between recruiting early enough to set yourself up well, but also not have a huge range of dropouts towards the end of that period just before the session starts. My hot tip for this one is if you're new to the unit, it's a really good idea to see if you can acquire a list of tutors who've tutored on the unit previously, not just the last delivery, but maybe even the delivery before. If they're still floating around as PhD students, I'd suggest canvassing those students first. There's no need for you and your teaching team to be learning the unit for the first time if you can get some experienced teachers in the fold. My second lesson is, as time-consuming as it might be, it does pay to take that time to vet your teaching staff for the suitability for your unit. And so part of this involves approaching course directors, unit directors, and other program directors, kindly asking them to disseminate your advertisement very strategically, or emailing them on to those who are part of those programs that might be suitable candidates. As a minimum, in that advertisement, I'd be suggesting asking for CVs from the get-go. That saves you an extra layer of email later, asking those who require to send their CVs on. I then very much routinely will send all the requirements for the unit in my first correspondence back to those who've expressed interest. That includes the dates of the marking being due, turnaround times, any information you can provide that might help your staff that you're recruiting to either self-select out of the unit. Nothing worse than getting to the marking phase and then your tutor or your marker telling you, oops, sorry, I'm off for a month for a conference overseas, and then needing to backfill that. And then, of course, reviewing the CVs that you do receive as a bare minimum. And if you have capacity, I would strongly recommend interviewing the candidates for your teaching team just to check for appropriateness and suitability there. Your faculty might have procedures set up where they do provide a pool of sessional teaching staff or unit conveners to use in their approach. School of Psychological Sciences put in a new procedure last year where we had this for the first time. What I learned the hard way is don't assume that they've been vetted. If you are provided with a list of tutors for your unit, it still pays to go through this process. And in my view, anyone who has expressed interest that you contact to engage in this kind of vetting and doesn't respond to you, it's probably not boding well, or is very difficult to pin down to set up a time to chat. It's probably not boding well in terms of their capacity to commit to the unit. And so that's something that I always see as extra, can't help but be a psychologist, but extra clinical information that I take on board when I'm selecting my teaching team. Third, if your department or school allows for it, I would strongly recommend appointing a senior tutor, also called the assistant to the convener, who can provide all manner of administrative support. And I've just listed some of the common tasks that senior tutors in the School of Psychological Sciences would assist with. I did not take full use of my senior tutor the first year I was in the gig in 2021. Learned a lot from that experience in 2022 as to how to more efficiently utilise my senior tutor to offer the assisting to the convener support. I would also say here that the ideal candidate is someone who has been a senior tutor on the unit before. You may not have that capacity to recruit that person. Otherwise, selecting someone with prior experience as a senior tutor for another unit or tutoring experience on your unit. There are pros and cons for both. I would say on the balance, I would probably take someone with experience as a senior tutor for another unit over someone who just has tutoring experiences on my unit if I had the choice there. Lesson 4, have a strategic approach to the tutorial classes that you open. So my policy comment here, if anyone asks, the story I'm sticking to is that I will say you should open tutorials at a wide range of times so as to best meet the needs of different students in line with the students first approach as per the NQ operating plan 2020-2024. That's what I'm telling people I've said here today. In reality, I will add a little addendum to that. And that is, while it is, of course, important that we cater for different students with different responsibilities and needs, and we want to be an inclusive teaching community, students will enroll in tutorials at different times as they're available because they have to enroll in tutorials. They need to be registered into a class. That does not mean that you will be able to staff tutorials at those times. And so what I learned the hard way is if I open too many tutorials between, say, 6 and 9 p.m. during the week, I am probably not going to have a lot of tutors putting their hands up to take those classes. And likewise, any tutorials that I open on a Friday afternoon from about 2 p.m. onwards are also going to be really hard to staff. So really important to balance the needs of students against the needs of the teaching for the unit and use things like doodle polls or similar to Canvas for tutor availability. So what I tend to do there is I pop all the classes that I'm planning on opening, and those last couple that I have question marks may open depending on unit enrollments, into a doodle poll, and I send it out to my tutors. My hot tip here is I would suggest not asking your tutors, which classes can you take when they respond to the doodle poll, but instead switching it to which classes would you not be able to take. It's a very subtle difference, but I find that it reduces tutor selectivity, or put another way, tutor pickiness. You can still ask your tutors, what would be your preferred classes, but I find that if you give them too much choice, you're going to have them give you the wish list rather than actually what they might be able to accommodate. With that, though, comes not making too many promises from the get-go. So recruit more tutors and markers than you need, particularly when you have large units, because people can fall through and you've got a larger scale to deal with in terms of coverage. But certainly don't make any promises. So I've learned that when I get my sort of pool of potential tutors, I'm sort of ranking those that I'm likely to keep no matter what, and the ones that maybe have suggested they've got very limited availability, or it might be harder to kind of match them to classes. And I'm sort of saying to them, my hope is to be able to offer you X number of tutorials. However, this will obviously be contingent on final unit numbers and class registrations. And I find that if I set that conversation up early, it avoids awkward conversations later. Because the reality is you won't know what your unit looks like until closer to the opening period of the session. This also extends to the specific classes that you're allocating tutors to, and if your assessment tasks are such that you've got different topics on your unit, and allocating markers to those, just again, not making any promises. One thing that I was taught by a colleague in the department is that when you're making your tutorial allocations for such big units, it really pays off to assign a relief tutor to each class. So that if someone takes a leave of absence, there's already someone that can automatically cover that class and can make a commitment to being available to cover that one as need to. And I thought that was a really handy tip that a colleague provided there. Lesson 6, there's no accident that this is probably my most dense slide, because I think this is probably the most important slide and lesson that I've learned along the way, and that's the importance of good, effective two-way engagement and communication with your teaching team. So I've got there some strategies that I've sort of had in place, which I'm sure many of you already use with your units, things like having a SharePoint site for your unit that all your tutors belong to and your markers as well. Using email distribution lists for tutors and markers. I find that I can then go ahead and schedule email reminders, just a heads up, your marking's due in a week, things like that. And I can do that well in advance of the session. And they just, once I've got those lists kind of set up and they kind of just self-function. I also tend to use live marker spreadsheets on SharePoint so that I can sort of go into the marker spreadsheets, check how markers are tracking, and do things like checking distributions and whatnot. I find that really handy as well in terms of having collaborative teaching spaces. And of course, regular team meetings. I find the online meetings, as much as we are all liking being back face-to-face, tend to be really handy, particularly for those who can't attend. You can then record it and have a link available to that on your SharePoint site for tutors or markers who weren't able to come in person. But I think most of all, personal touches really do matter. I think that taking the time to really invest in your teaching staff, because at its core, this is really about people management. And so providing and sharing positive feedback, enabling genuine opportunities for collaboration and co-design. An example is, even well after the unit, I'm meeting with one of my tutors from last year tomorrow, who wanted to provide some feedback on the unit that I could take into consideration for this year's delivery. And so we're doing that. And I am genuinely interested in what she has to say based on her experience having tutored and marked on the unit. Regular email check-ins and whatnot. I find that this really engenders a lot of goodwill and loyalty that pays dividends later. So for example, I had a situation last year where I had a lot of markers who were either dropping like flies with illness or various other things that came up, or otherwise just not, I guess, committing to their responsibilities with marking and wanting to reduce their allocations at the 11th hour. I was able to send out a quite assertive email which weeded between those who actually really couldn't commit to the marking they'd originally committed to for very good reasons. I then had emails from others going, yeah, sorry, Joe, don't worry about it. I can get it done. And then for those who weren't able to commit, I was able to then approach others and be like, hey, is there any chance you could take a little bit more? And I found that the personal approaches and the touches along the way really helped to build those relationships and to foster a sense of camaraderie amongst my team. And I don't think that would have been as possible without that. In terms of hot tips for this one, creating a WhatsApp group for your unit. I put a question mark there because I've done that in 2 successive years and I've had varying success with that. It does also mean providing your contact details to all your tutors and markers, which some people might feel a little bit funny about as a unit convener. But I did find that having a way to contact my tutors and having them to contact me very quickly really pays off. I had a few situations last year where someone's tutorial room got co-opted by some other random tutor for another unit and they didn't know where to go. And so I had to quickly, they called me and I was able to log on to the timetabling system and find a spare room for them and so on and so on. So it really helps to be available to your teaching team within the boundaries of what's appropriate. And then I think something that we would probably all do naturally, as we do for our students, when a tutor or marker asks a question, rather than emailing the tutor or marker back, I'll post the question to the email distribution list so that everyone is benefiting from the response. And that, of course, then contributes to standardization of unit delivery as well. Also contributing to that is providing resources, lots of resources for your tutors. It's really important to make sure your teaching team is well resourced to do their job effectively. And so I've got some indications there of things that I provide my teaching team that seem to help. So really logical standalone guides and materials for delivery of tutorials, those well thought out marking rubrics and instructions for the marking process that I know we all put together, offering exemplar marking samples, and importantly at all grade levels, from a below expected standards right up to a high distinction, so that they can see what the differences might be. Examples of the kind of feedback they can provide to students. That includes sharing Turnitin Feedback Studio quick marks for your unit with your teaching team, which means that they've already got them prepared. They don't need to create them themselves and everyone's using the same quick marks. My other hot tip for this one is I tend to have an experienced tutor deliver the first class of the cycle in that tutorial, and they record that. So usually if I can get my online tutors, those delivering the online classes, to do that one, I then make those recordings available immediately to all my other tutors. And that means novice tutors who are preparing for the next tutorial are like, oh, I don't really know how to do that activity, or I'm a bit of a loss of how to make that work, can look at the recording and then get some ideas before they deliver their own tutorial. And I guess lesson 8, really important to invest in those processes that encourage standardization across the teaching team. This includes marker training and tutor training, as well as mentoring as necessary, thinking through moderation of marking carefully and in line with the assessment policy, conducting double marking for calibration purposes for both markers who might be new to the unit as well as those who've tutored before, and doing that early in the process. What I tend to do is I tend to ask my new tutors to send me 2 scripts that they've marked from the first 5 that they've looked at, and then 1 from the next 5. So I'm marking 3 of 10. And then I ask my experienced tutors to just send me 3 of the first 10 that they've marked to look at, so I can sort of calibrate between topics and tutors. Obviously, with increasing scales, you need to carefully look at that. It doesn't take much to do the maths. I've got a 1,500 word assignment. With 15 tutors, it very quickly, gets up to about 75 to 80 double marking scripts before you even look at your other double marking, which is usually for anything that scores below expected standards or on the border, and possibly also your high distinction grade. So it's a lot of double marking, but it pays to have that standardization. Students will talk, and I think if you can ensure that you've got these processes in place, and I actually communicate them to the students, what I'm doing with my teaching team, and I send out that list of everything that we've done as a teaching team together to coordinate things, that can really help. Reviewing mark distributions systematically, again in line with the standards-based marking implicit in the assessment policy. So not for necessarily, oh, you know, everyone needs to have the same distribution, but just making sure that everyone's applying the standards in the same way. And of course, initiating dialogues and communicating with your teaching team. I really find it helpful to grab my experienced tutors in meetings and ask them, you know, what tips do you have for the new tutors? It's really handy. They're the best place to provide that advice, and it makes them feel really valued as well, in terms of sharing their expert knowledge. There's strength in numbers, but watch out for too many cooks. So do take advantage of your strong teaching team in terms of the numbers, and delegate tasks. I've got some examples of some things I tend to delegate to my tutors and markers. And also the importance of making sure that you reallocate marking swiftly if people in the team aren't able to stick to their marking quotas. Last year, I fell into a bit of trouble where I gave some tutors some benefit of the doubt and some markers the benefit of the doubt when they said they weren't going to get their marking to me. And I wish I just sort of pulled the trigger early and reallocated. I had the numbers in my teaching team to do it. And it would have prevented the last minute tussle that we ended up in at the end of the year. Delegation is good, but just remember the importance of standardization. So make judicious decisions about what you delegate and monitor accordingly. So for example, the application of penalties, late penalties, word penalties. I tend to not like have too many hands in the grade book doing that. So I tend to assign that task to my senior tutor, given they're the ones who are going to be receiving the special consideration requests as well, and your tutors won't have that benefit. One thing I have taken to doing is asking tutors to contribute to the iLearn discussion forum. I sort of say to them, look, even if you can just do 10 minutes at the end of your tutorial after class, when you go back to the office, that will be a huge help. And if you think about it, we've usually got tutorials that cover the entire week. So that's really good standard coverage in terms of getting, you know, tutors to contribute to that. If you've got 15 tutors, they all take care of one question on the discussion board. That's 15 less for you as the unit convener. And finally, just remembering that not all humans are created equally. Just like any team, members of your team will have different strengths, areas of strength and areas of challenge. Most are still, after all, students, so do keep your expectations in check when it comes to your teaching team. They won't reply to emails. They may not abide by what, you know, the marking deadlines. I had a situation last year where I think a tutor confused her teaching gig with a dating app and took to ghosting me when asking for updates about marking, how they were going. That's where having your live marker spreadsheets comes in handy, and consider performance management when needed. So my tip here is to keep really good notes. You'll forget year to year which, with such a big team, who's proven to be an asset and who requires further development. Reads you may not want to touch again with a 10-foot pole. And so I guess finally, just some final tips there, but what I'll leave you with is a quote that I read out of an article that was published quite a while ago, but I think still applies, which is just remembering that academics who lead large teaching teams of often inexperienced sessional staff have a dual role in professional development. They're both a provider and a participant, so providing to the teaching team, but also participating in their own professional development. And so not to be afraid to ask for extra support. And I guess that's where our professional learning and development team at the university comes in. But yeah, I'll sort of open it up to questions.
Thank you, Jo. That's really great to hear the lessons you've learned.